Welcome, and thank you for joining me as I discuss my paper titled Calling on Lucina, a Parturition Scene on a Roman Lamp. I am Dr. Christie Vogler, a former graduate student at the University of Iowa, and now an assistant professor of history at the University of Lynchburg. This paper is based on my dissertation research at the archaeological site of Vecchio in Sicily. Recent excavation seasons of the Vecchio archaeological project have focused on parcel 19 in the eastern portion of the property. Ground penetrating radar and wide strip excavation of a 10 by 10 meter section have been in use to investigate the top of a mound, which earlier survey work had identified as the area with the highest concentration of Roman artifacts on the property. Excavations over 4 field seasons have revealed a Roman wall, likely connected to a Roman villa dating to the 1st to 4th century CE. Questions about the layout of the structure persist, including its relation to a possible nearby sanctuary dedicated to a fertility deity, but the artifact count from parcel 19 is extraordinary. This, paired with evidence of structural collapse and burning, as well as burials 7 and 8 that currently appear unintentional, argues for some cataclysmic event, such as an earthquake or landslide, that resulted in the excellent preservation of the material record here. The Roman villa and baths at Piazza Armerina in the nearby region of Enna were preserved in a similar manner. In the summer 2015 field season of Vecchio archaeological project, student excavators spent a majority of the time digging through an overburden zone that reached down approximately 40 centimeters across the entirety of the 5 by 5 meter Saggio F. Within this immense plow zone context, which was designated US 40, an abundance of artifact material dating from the 1st century BCE to the 4th century CE was recovered. The remarkable collection of artifacts from this context provided strong evidence for identifying the site as a wealthy Roman villa structure. Some of the more spectacular finds in this single context included nearly 80 fragments of bone hairpins, various examples of stamped pottery showing erotic scenes or imagery relating to fertility, and the first few instances of bronze objects that would later be identified as likely medical implements. In the following field seasons of 2017 and 2019, more medical tools, some relating to bone surgery, were recovered and identified through comparison of medical toolkits retrieved from the Roman site of Pompeii. Of particular interest to this paper, however, was a single lamp fragment from US 40, which we believed at the time of discovery depicted an odd erotic scene. This was in keeping with other examples of sexually explicit images we had found on other ceramics, and it fit with the overall theme of a wealthy Roman villa. Upon further reflection and discussion, though, my colleagues and I began to consider a new reading of this particular image as a rare depiction of childbirth, the likes of which none of us had ever seen before. And here is that lamp fragment. Reading and interpreting a new image is no easy feat, so I adopted Christian Souvenu-Inwood's methodology for reading ancient images with mythological subjects. In her analysis of a Theseus and Medea motif found on Greek vases dating to the 5th century BCE, she emphasizes that modern readers of ancient images must attempt to understand the meanings of those images from the perspective of the society in which the images were produced. To reconstruct the perceptual filters through which ancient images were inscribed and read at the time of their production, Souvenu-Inwood calls for both an iconographic analysis, which includes the conventions, codifications, and modalities of the signifying system, as well as a semantic analysis, which is the knowledge, ideas, assumptions, and mentality that constitute the semantic fields related to, inscribed in, and called up by the signifiers under consideration. This is done in the two processes of meaning production, the inscription of meanings and the representations by the artists, and the extraction of meaning, the making sense of the scenes by the viewers. This can be achieved by independent but correlative investigations of comparative iconographic elements of an image and textual references to those images. Such analyses of ancient images, especially a semantic analysis, are only possible with the availability of primary sources discussing the subject matter. For a parturition scene lacking a specific reference to myth, this could prove difficult, though such references do exist, as I will show on the next slide. Therefore, I started with an iconographic analysis of this scene by breaking the image down into 3 main iconographic elements: a squatting, naked female figure, footstools, and a swirling cone shape that I would later come to identify as a swaddled infant. Before turning to the iconographic elements, I do want to highlight a few examples of ancient written descriptions of childbirth, some practical, others mythological. These can help us with the semantic readings of the iconographic elements, as can be seen with Cyrannus' detailed description of a birthing chair in his medical text Gynecology, but it can also help inform us to the possible functions of childbirth imagery, as we can see with the inscriptions included on magic gems that also depict crouching female figures, some with distended bellies. Though I myself have found only a few mythological references to childbirth, the two examples included here indicate how this event may have been perceived to include, if not require, divine involvement. In this particular case, the divine involvement is of the goddess Lucina, which is the Roman equivalent of the Greek goddess of childbirth, Aletheia. This is important to keep in mind when we consider the function of the parturition scene stamped on the discus of the Roman lamp that was discovered at Ganjavecchio. After I broke down the image into its three iconographic elements, the next step was to try to identify comparative iconographic elements, ideally dating to the same period and located within the contact zone of the Roman Empire. Fortunately, Phil Perkins completed much of the groundwork for this survey research in his investigation of a Bucaro ceramic shard from Poggio Calla, dated to the late Orientalizing period of the 7th to 6th century BCE. Perkins' ceramic fragment included what appears to be a childbirth stamp on the outside face of either a lid or base of a carinated bowl. Unfortunately, his study revealed that there were very few comparable images produced in Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, and Southwest Asia around that particular time period, which led him to conclude that the Etruscan scene from Poggio Calla was a very rare, detailed representation of human fertility. On the other hand, the use of the particular iconographic element of a female crouching figure appears to span millennia in various locations around the ancient Mediterranean, which does make it difficult, if not impossible, to trace a direct origin or inspiration for Perkins' image of a birthing woman that was found on the Poggio Calla shard and our later molded lamp fragment from Ganjavecchio. Some of the earliest examples of a crouching human form found in the Mediterranean come from southwest Cyprus. Dating to the Middle Chalcolithic, 3528 to 2800 BCE, is a cache of picrolite pendants called cruciform figurines, which depict women in childbirth. According to Budin's survey of maternity images in ancient Cyprus, these picrolite images are often recovered from mortuary and settlement contexts. In the case of mortuary settings, no pendants have been associated with male remains, only women and children. Budin notes all examples display the cruciform shape, rendered by a vertical body with horizontally outstretched arms. All examples have a vaguely phallic, upturned head and a bent knee squatting posture. Furthermore, when sexual attributes are rendered on the figure, it is in the form of breasts, which appear on approximately 14% of the figurines. Although there is no writing available on these cruciform figurines, Budin concludes that the consistent form of the figure, along with its association with women and children in mortuary settings, suggests that they are associated with childbirth. Anna Campo has taken this idea further to suggest that the figurines were charms or amulets intended to promote successful pregnancy and parturition through sympathetic magic. Microscopic wear analysis of some of the figurines appear to support her argument because they show all over wear patterns. Budin suggests that the figurines were not just worn as jewelry, as we see in this example of a figurine wearing a figurine, which would only induce wear on one side, but that they were held by women during parturition, functioning as magical aids to childbirth. I would take this even a step further to suggest that the figurines may have functioned as sort of stress balls, which women would hold and squeeze during contractions. These squatting figurines appear to fall out of use by the late Chalcolithic in favor of chorotrophic forms, but the imagery of squatting women does not disappear completely from Cyprus or the greater Mediterranean world. Perkins points to a late Cypriot cylindrical seal stone dating to 1400 1150 BCE that displays two nude female figures with their buttocks resting on stools or blocks with their legs spread and knees bent, which is more similar to the crouching stance seen on the Etruscan Bucaro stamp and on our Roman lamp fragment from Ganjavecchio. In fact, many of the ancient Mediterranean childbirth images Perkins identifies includes a second iconographic element of birthing stools or bricks. Birthing bricks have been attested to in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, but their practical and religious association to childbirth is better documented in the latter. Later, first millennium BC Egypt appears to be one of the few regions where the representation of birth was less restricted than in Greece and later Rome, where choreographic imagery or unnatural mythological births were the preferred representation of childbirth and maternity. Examples of ritual birthing bricks have been discovered in mortuary settings, including New Kingdom royal tombs, suggesting ties to rebirth and afterlife. Yet a similar birthing brick was recovered from a domestic context in Abydos, dating to the 13th dynasty. Though birthing bricks and stools are attested to throughout the Mediterranean, both in imagery and in writing, Perkins notes that differing birthing positions of kneeling versus crouching seen in some of these images could reflect a cultural difference in birthing practices. One interesting exception to the early Greek representation of childbirth are so called Baubo figurines and amulets that appear popular in Greece until the Hellenistic period. Eventually, the imagery becomes even more popular in later Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, though. The squatting position of the figure on the stamped lamp fragment from Gonjavecchio strongly emulates this imagery. Two bronze statuettes, one from an Egyptian temple to Heracles and Heraklion near Alexandria, depict a woman spreading her legs and threatening her womb with a club. Engraved gems of the imperial age use similar iconography to these statuettes. Two gems from Ptolemaic Egypt depict a woman standing with her legs spread or touching her genitals, and these gems bear the inscription Omphale and provide the unexpected model of a woman, often pregnant, always combative, mastering her body and warding off malevolent influences from herself. These gems were commonly produced in the Eastern Mediterranean, but have been found throughout the Roman Empire. It is believed Omphale was introduced into Hellenistic cults during the 4th to 3rd century BCE as a female counterpart to the hero Heracles. Her inclusion in Hellenistic cults allowed for a space where concerns relating to female fertility could be a central focus. The connection between Omphale and Heracles is made clear thanks to a few gems that depict not the female figure Omphale, but rather the hero Heracles, or his Egyptian equivalent Seth, juxtaposed with a womb. The substitution of Heracles' Seth in this instance leads scholars to read the scene as forcing the womb not to produce diseases. This reading is supported by one gem that features the inscription included on the previous slide, which translates to "Stay in your place, womb, lest Typhon seize upon you." A similarly functioning Greco-Roman amulet found in Britain, but inscribed with words, not images, translates to read, "Make with your holy names that Fabia, whom Terentia her mother bore, being in full fitness and health, shall master the unborn child and bring it to birth." Tomlin comments on this particular inscription, noting, "In view of the hazards and painful delays of childbirth, the idea that a mother should master the unborn child is understandable. It may be part of the popular belief that in childbirth the womb was passive and the baby active." As all these gems indicate, specific mythological figures could be used interchangeably to serve the same purpose. In each case, the purpose of these gems and amulets is to control the womb so that it may successfully produce a child. In all, the iconographic evidence strongly indicates the imagery of a crouched figure, especially a female figure, was utilized in amulets and votive objects to promote successful childbirth. It must be acknowledged, however, that much of the iconographic evidence originates from locations mostly on the periphery of the Roman world. Sicily's unique position as a central location and multiple transfer point within the Mediterranean likely allowed people to access various iconographic forms from both the periphery and Rome proper. As such, the development of new iconographic forms in Sicily that ultimately function in the same manner in various locations is not out of the realm of possibility. We see this with some of the Ptolemaic gems that included an anatomical model of the uterus, another iconographic element incorporated in votive offering imagery found in other regions of the Roman world. In many cases, dedicating a model of a given part of the human body is well attested in Greece, but anatomical terracotta models are also common dedications throughout Etruria, Latium, and Campania from the 4th to 1st centuries BCE. Such votives are related to requests for healing or are given in thanks to the deity who may have already rendered a curative service to the dedicant. There is one particular anatomical model that likely functions in a different manner, though, the one meant to represent a uterus. Instead of a request or thanks for healing, these models were more likely dedicated in order to promote and protect fertility and reproduction. While a few different models for terracotta uteri exist, most represent an ovoidal organ comprised of a series of rounded horizontal ridges with an elliptical opening as the cervix. Emmerman notes how the ridges are conventionally interpreted as the muscles of the uterus contracting during labor. The patterns seen on the terracotta uteri mimic the style of swaddling seen on various representations of swaddled infants. The correlation of this pattern between the two types of terracotta votives is further emphasized by the fact that these types of models are commonly found together at sanctuary sites where a cult to a fertility deity is housed, such as the Italic temple at Paestum. One of the few examples of an actual parturition scene that includes both the figure of a woman and an infant comes from the Kom Ombo temple dating to the Ptolemaic dynasty. Perkins explains that this image has a long history within Egypt. Indeed, much earlier, to give birth is represented by an Old Kingdom composite hieroglyph depicting a kneeling woman in profile giving birth to the sign Mes, a three-pronged shape that, by the Ptolemaic period, had become an ideogram of the head and arms of an emerging baby. This ideogram differs from the crouching female figure in that it displays the woman in a kneeling birthing position, but this appears consistent with the use of birthing bricks. The images suggest that a woman in labor could squat on these bricks, also known as meshknet bricks, because of their association with the Egyptian goddess of childbirth, so as to raise the woman above the ground level in order to assist with the delivery of the infant. Returning to the imagery seen on the lamp from Ganjavecchio, the positioning of the female figure's feet on what appears to be small footstools likely is associated with the Egyptian birthing bricks or something comparable. Surprisingly, the best analogous example of the imagery seen on this lamp does in fact come from Rome. The particular scene I am referring to comes from a series of 4 marble relief panels that represent various moments in childbirth, with the 5th panel depicting a scene of breastfeeding. One panel depicts a naked woman crouching on a cushioned and draped couch with her feet positioned on a footstool very similar in style to the one depicted on the stamped lamp from parcel 19. All 5 panels share many stylistic features and may represent a narrative sequence of the stages of childbirth. Alas, all the panels are unknown provenience, and there are doubts regarding the authenticity of these reliefs due to their unusually explicit subject matter and the figures' non-classical poses. Those factors, paired with an absence of authentic ancient parallels, forces Perkins to recommend that the panels be omitted from consideration until more is learned about their original context. Yet, the stamped lamp from parcel 19, in an unquestionable ancient stratigraphic context, may be one of many examples yet to be discovered and identified as a childbirth scene, which would then force scholars to revisit the issue of authenticity for these intriguing marble panels, at least in regards to the explicit subject matter of the scenes. If nothing else, should the marble panels prove to be counterfeit, we might consider the idea the themes depicted come from authentic pieces that archaeologists and scholars have failed to recognize and publish. To understand the function of this lamp, it's important to consider the assemblage of artifacts with which it was found, including objects of female adornment, other erotic imagery, and the medical tools. Lamps are prevalent throughout the Greco-Roman world and serve a duality of purposes. Other lamps with sexually explicit scenes are likely indications of status. John R. Clarke has made the point that these images were not considered pornographic or shameful, but rather Romans usually associated them with luxury, pleasure, and high status. In other instances, lamps can serve as a funerary dedication. This lamp depicting a childbirth scene might serve a similar function to commemorate a former midwife or even to honor a woman who died in childbirth. However, in the context of the collection of female adornment objects, one could view this as an attempt to display wealth while not appearing gaudy. Berg makes the argument that because wealthy Roman women were expected to be modest, they would incorporate gender-appropriate symbols into their ornamentation to demarcate their wealth and status. Symbols promoting fertility were commonly used in this manner. None of these interpretations, however, take into consideration the presence of a medical toolkit. In another work, Berg's analysis of literary sources implies that women, more so than men, performed alternative care for the treatment of illness, which was more highly dependent on magical medical solutions. Unlike the medical tradition espoused by Galen or Soranus that provided scientific treatments, women would have worked with a combination of pharmaceutical and magical knowledge to produce cures or treat patients. An appropriate alternative function for this lamp depicting a childbirth scene then may be comparable to the votive objects and amulets discussed in the previous section. In other words, could this lamp be meant to promote successful childbirth? I would argue this is most likely the case. It also connects back to an important aspect of the midwife's role. Billie Jean Collins looks at early religious roles for women in Hittite culture and notes marriage, birth, and death are considered the traditional spheres of women's religion. In the case of Hittites in Anatolia, we have evidence for several rituals relating to birth, which the midwife was expected to supervise. While making the delivery, the midwife also had a strong magical mythological role to fulfill. Collins explains that the midwife would recite incantations throughout labor and delivery on behalf of the mother and the newborn child. The ancient Greek and Romans likewise appear to view midwives as having dual roles of medical specialist and magical practitioner. Thanks to Soranus and his work Gynecology, we have some knowledge about the medical ritual actions midwives were expected to perform after an infant was born. First, the midwife makes a gesture indicating the sex of the child, and then she places the newborn on the earth to examine its condition. According to Veronique Dason's overview of childbirth and infancy in antiquity, this was the moment at which the midwife would determine if the newborn should be accepted and reared by the parents. This moment of inspecting the infant for physical soundness is sometimes represented with mythological divine models on carved gems dating to the Roman imperial period. In one example, seen on a gem from the British Museum, the central figure standing before the infant holds a spindle and distaff. Dason reads the manipulation of spindle and distaff as a possible metaphorical reference to the act of cutting the umbilical cord, implying that the midwife is the human doublet of the Parcae Amorae, and like them, determining life or death and prospects for the future. Just as the midwife needs certain tools to handle the physical aspects of childbirth, it is reasonable to assume that she also required certain tools to assist with the magical ritual aspects of childbirth, of which our stamp lamp may be an example of. Turning to another region of the ancient Mediterranean world, we find examples of how lamps served as important tools in ritual practice. According to Carol Myers, in Iron Age Israel, as well as other parts of the Mediterranean during this time period, shiny objects of any kind were believed to deter evil spirits, which instead favored the dark. Referencing Susan Sarad's ethnographic work in Jerusalem, where Kurdish women wore silver-threaded amulets made by female ritual specialists for protection during their pregnancies, Myers notes how the archaeological record for the region finds similar metal items of personal adornment along with clay oil lamps. As such, she concludes that both these flashy adornments and the light provided from the lamps at some point serve to protect the wearer user from malevolent forces. Since reproductive problems could often be attributed to evil spirits or other malevolent forces, many cultures in the Mediterranean resorted to these protective folk customs. Furthermore, the Romans appeared to likewise draw connections between light and successful childbirth in their mythology. More commonly referenced by her Greek name, Aletheia, which means she who comes to aid or relieve, her Roman counterpart was Lucina, meaning light bringer, which is closely related to the term lucerna, the Latin word for lamp. Both these flashy adornments and the light provided from the lamps serve to protect the wearer user from malevolent forces in a similar manner to the magic gems mentioned earlier. Therefore, the Parturition lamp of Parcel 19 likely served a dual function. It promoted the successful childbirth through sympathetic representation of the event, and it acted as a deterrent to any malevolent forces through its function of providing light, possibly by invoking the goddess Lucina. Perkins ends his own analysis of parturition scenes in the ancient Mediterranean world by concluding, the rarity in the Mediterranean images of depicting the moment of childbirth suggests that either there was no general motivation for the production of such images, or, more likely, that a cultural taboo existed against representing this fundamental moment in the human life cycle. However, I wonder if this is one of those moments, not uncommon to archaeology, where an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Where imagery relating to pregnancy and childbirth is most prevalent is not on monumental displays of wealth and status meant for public consumption, but instead on the small, practical, and personal items meant to aid an individual, and in this case, women. One of the main purposes of this presentation is to call for a re-examination of the material record to learn if this image is as is as unique as originally believed, or if, as I am coming to suspect, is one variant example of a genre that has gone unnoticed and uncommented upon by modern archaeologists and scholars. Lastly, although I argue this particular parturition scene is meant to promote a successful childbirth, it is problematic to suggest all the images touched on in this paper function in the same manner. Instead, we should think about how these images operated as an aspect of ancient reproduction management. I borrowed this phrase from Barbara Voss, who defines reproduction management as both the prevention and the promotion of conception, as well as measures taken to interrupt or support the development of the embryo or fetus, and to care for the birthing mother and infant before, during, and after delivery. Voss uses this concept as a critique of the assumption often made in archaeology that all sexual acts are, or should be, oriented toward reproduction. We see this most often in the archaeological tendency to interpret representations of the unclothed body and of sexual acts as evidence of fertility rites. Though, as previously mentioned in Roman archaeology, there has been some recognition that such representations can also be used as status markers. If we return to the one magical gem with the inscription reading, "Stay in your place, womb, lest Typhon seize upon you," the assumption we usually make is that the user of this gemstone wished to become pregnant. Yet all the inscription really suggests is that the woman wishes for the womb to behave. As such, we should be open to alternative readings and functions of such imagery by recognizing that women of the past, much like women today, were not constantly attempting to become pregnant. Instead, variations of this imagery may have been employed to manage other aspects of ancient women's reproductive health. Thank you for your time today. Here are the sources referenced in my presentation, as well as my contact information. I'm happy to respond to questions and comments now, but if you have come across new material relating to my topic in the future, please reach out.